A huge amount of the world's largest banks are all about to collapse. Institutions that were once the pillars of the West's economy are now starting to go under. Just this month, Credit Suisse was forced to restructure itself after losing half of the company's stock value in only a year. Deutsche Bank is also facing some serious losses, with their stock price dropping by over a quarter in recent months, with many economists predicting Deutsche Bank to go bankrupt in just the next year. And it seems like these stories are pretty much the same all across the board, with even Morgan Stanley recently closing down one of their companies, losing them over $900 million in the process, along with Goldman Sachs, who's now being forced to lay off hundreds and hundreds of their employees. So what's going on here? Well, there's several reasons why all these major banks are collapsing, and we're going to be going from the least to the most dark reasons for their collapse. 5 being the lightest reason and 1 being the darkest reason. And trust me, these reasons will get very dark. So let's start from the 5th reason the major banks are collapsing. This being CDOs, collateralized debt obligations, which in simpler terms means a bundle of debts packaged together. And this is one of the key reasons that banks are losing tons of their stock value right now. Now normally these collateralized debt obligations are a good investment. They're simply just a collection of debts bundled together into a package. They don't all have to be good debts either. As long as most of them will be paid back, the overall package maintains its value. And while the economic climate is stable, this can be a good investment opportunity as most of the loans in the package will be paid back. But if some sort of crisis happens and most of the debts go bad, then the CDO itself loses masses of value. And this happened before the subprime mortgage disaster of 2008. You see, before the crash, lots of investment banks saw these products as a good investment. So long as nothing catastrophic happened, they would make money. The problem came when attention stopped being put on how stable these debts really were, and instead on how much money could be squeezed out of them. Banks then started investing more and more into CDOs, and even began creating them out of thin air, filling them with bad loans. And so it didn't take long for this banker exploitation to reach a breaking point, creating a massive debt bubble. And when the bubble popped, it became the main cause for the Great Recession, as the banks found out that the billions and billions they put into CDOs were now worthless, all simply because investment banks had gotten too greedy. But in a bubble, they're like a live hand grenade, just waiting to explode. But the reason why people continued with this is that the CDO market was worth over $200 billion. That is a lot in banking bonuses for the executives. And that's why, even though you'd think surely the bank should know the risks by now, they haven't actually learned their lesson, because this money is too big to ignore. And time after time, these big banks have shown themselves willing to take advantage of any lucrative opportunity, no matter the consequences. But what people didn't expect was that these banking titans could actually collapse. Before the 2008 financial crisis, everyone talked about the banks like they were the Titanic. It was too big to fail. If these banks actually did fail, the consequences would be unimaginable. When Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns both collapsed, it was unprecedented. But it seems like those privileged few at the top of the banking world have failed to learn any lessons, because the banks of today have made the exact same mistakes, and the consequences will affect each and every one of us. Because when the banks collapse, when the economy crashes, the taxpayers are the ones who have to eventually bail them out. And lucky for you, CDOs are back, the very same products that led directly to the 2008 financial crash. In fact, the CDO market is booming. It's expected to reach over $185 billion by 2026, almost back to its 2008 levels. But an even more concerning thing about this is that synthetic CDOs are also on the rise as well, and at an even faster rate. Now, to make clear, synthetic CDOs are where banks bet on CDOs keeping their value. This means that investment banks can stake even more money on the same CDOs, creating a massive house of cards. So when it all blows up, the bank's losses are only multiplied. In fact, these were some of the most damaging assets in the financial crisis, the ones that brought the big banks to their knees. And surprise, surprise, the amount of synthetic CDOs is on track to quadruple this year, rising to around $40 billion. With a record like this, it's no wonder so many major banks are close to failing. They've become so comfortable in their position at the top that they thought they were again above the law. And to be fair, in many ways they're right. Pretty much nobody was arrested after they crashed the entire world's economy in 2008, all for their personal gain. So if they could extract personal billions, why not do more exploiting now? If the same thing happens again, and these banks collapse under the weight of their own crimes, the world's governments may again bail them out a second time, all being paid for by your taxes. I mean, after the last financial crisis, only one banker was arrested, but this is only the start of the major banks' reckless actions in the last decade, which leads us on to the 4th fourth reason that the banks are in deep trouble right now, and that being corruption. For example, both Credit Suisse and Deutsche Bank have been involved in numerous controversies over the past few years, and each year they've been getting worse and worse. Credit Suisse alone has roughly had at least one major crisis every year since 2017. They broke their streak in 2020, but they made up for it this year with 4 separate scandals. And while Credit Suisse is just one bank, they're symptomatic of a much wider, deeper corruption in the banking industry. And Deutsche Bank has also dealt with their fair share of bribery and corruption scandals in the past few years, as have most other banks across the world. But to understand how it's so awful today, we need to get some context on how the banks got more and more corrupt. During the early 2010s, Credit Suisse were involved in a massive scandal that rocked the financial world, and it all centered around Mozambique. And this scandal would be the start of Credit Suisse's slippery slope of corruption. You see, Credit Suisse had made a deal to organize some harmless-looking investments into the Mozambique fishing industry, and over the years they continued to broker more and more loans to the country's finance minister, Manuel Chang. These were intended for use in the country's fishing industry and to generally better the lives of its citizens. By giving more money to Mozambique, they would develop the Mozambique economy, giving the Mozambique people more jobs, and in return more money to spend back in their economy. And so at first this seemed great, and by the end of 2016, Credit Suisse had organized over $1.3 billion in loans to one of the poorest countries in the world, all destined to be invested into the tuna industry. This money came from all sorts of investors around the world, but of course this seemed all too good to be true, as lots of this money went strangely missing. In fact, a large part of the funds never even got to the people they were meant for. Instead, it went straight into the pockets of corrupt officials in Mozambique's government. But in addition to this, around $50 million of this money also went to Credit Suisse themselves in the form of kickbacks. Or in simpler terms, this was money that the bankers were paid to broker more and better deals for the corrupt Mozambique officials. They would also get massive commissions from the $1.3 billion they organized from other investors, whilst making money back from the corrupt Mozambique officials. And of course, this would end in disaster. The whole episode in fact crashed Mozambique's already fragile economy whilst lining the pockets of a few incredibly wealthy bankers. And in the grand scheme of things, they only made around $50 million from this, which really isn't that much for Credit Suisse, a giant multi-billion-dollar banking institution. In fact, they make billions in revenue every single month. But still, these executives went out of their way to ruin Mozambique's economy, one of the poorest in the world, for simply a few more million. That money would have meant so much more to so many people, but instead it lined the pockets of a few wealthy bankers, making them marginally richer, and the damage done to Mozambique was incalculable.
It was 2 days of mayhem, an eruption of anger that caught the authorities wrong-footed.
With around 60% of the country still living in extreme poverty. Once the truth came out, Credit Suisse was fined heavily, being slammed with a bill of $400 million to pay back to investors. But did they learn their lesson? Was this just a one-off crime by some rogue bankers? Well, of course not. It's only gotten worse since then. More and more scandals are uncovered every day. In 2018, they agreed to pay $77 million after being exposed for similar corruption in the Asia-Pacific region. But don't get me wrong, this isn't just Credit Suisse. All the other banks are involved in the same sort of deals. Deutsche Bank was fined over $258 million by the US after they were caught doing business with dictatorships in Libya, Iran, Burma, and Sudan, all countries under international sanctions. Deutsche Bank made deals to evade sanctions and prop up authoritarian regimes just for profit, and it's estimated that they made over 27,000 deals valued at over $10 billion. Dodging sanctions has seemingly become an addiction for Deutsche Bank. They just can't stop. In 2017, they were caught laundering over $10 billion out of Russia, but we're only talking about confirmed cases. The real amount could have been over $80 billion. Deutsche Bank has continued to make deals with Russian oligarchs despite the damage they've caused the world. Blinded by greed, they're willing to break laws and incur fines if it's worth it in the long run. As recently as 2020, they've stated they're looking to further expand into Russia. As other businesses leave Russia in the wake of their invasion of Ukraine, Deutsche Bank stays. In fact, they pretty much had to be forced out of the country, only agreeing to wind down their operations after mountains of criticism and controversy. And this is the key reason why Deutsche Bank is losing so much money, because the public doesn't trust them anymore. And it's the same with all the banks. This growing controversy, this growing distrust of people's savings in these banks makes people want to pull their money out and their stocks with it, which is starting to bleed these banks dry. Citigroup, the sixth largest investment bank in the world, has also ran into trouble recently. Like all these banks, they were fined $400 million by regulators for dangerously risky business practices. The bank, which has already received a massive bailout from taxpayers after the 2008 crash, was found to have been reckless in their neglect of risk management. You would think that nearly collapsing just a decade before would be enough incentive to clean up their act, but it wasn't. Citigroup didn't pay any mind to risk management and instead made a series of blunders, culminating in accidentally sending a company $900 million more than they were meant to. Instead of sending some creditors the interest on a loan, they instead sent the full amount by mistake, and it's unlikely that they'll ever get this money back either. In response, they fired their CEO and pledged to put $1 billion more into risk management services, but the damage had already been done. And they're just like all these other banks. They couldn't care less about the consequences of their actions on society, everyday working people, and their own company. And that's why during this recession, people are pulling out of these major banks, because time after time, they are showing themselves to be incompetent and dangerous. Now, we don't have time to go into all of the controversy surrounding these investment banks, but hopefully just understanding just some of these cases makes you realize how decrepit the banks truly are. The amount of money that these investment banks have been leaking to fines and penalties, and their disastrous actions to society is astronomical. And they get away with this because usually these banks are able to afford it. And that would still be the case if it weren't for the third reason that investment banks are due for a huge collapse. But before I continue, I want to shout out today's sponsor, Established Titles. Established Titles is a project based on a historic Scottish custom where landowners are referred to lairds, lords, or ladies. What Established Titles does is give you 1 square foot of land, so you can call yourself a lord or a lady and provide you an official certificate with a crest. Once you have your certificate, you'll have a unique plot number to see the exact location of your land. By owning this land, Established Titles allows you to change your name to lord or lady on credit cards, plane tickets, even dating profiles, and so much more. And even better is that Established Titles plants a tree with every order and works with global charities One Tree Planted and Trees for the Future to support reforestation efforts. And right now, Established Titles told me that the first 200 people purchasing a title pack using my link will effectively be next to my plot, just within a few minutes of walking distance. And so depending on how many of you want to become a lord or a lady, we can build our own little moon kingdom. It makes an amazing last minute gift, and right now they have a massive Black Friday sale. Plus, if you use code BLACKMOON, you'll get an additional 10% off. So go to establishedtitles.com/blackmoon. And this being CLOs, one of the most incredibly damaging things to each and every one of us that you've probably never heard of. So let me explain. CLOs, as the name might imply, are incredibly similar to the CDOs that we've already discussed. They're a collection of loans, but unlike CDOs, they're made up of business and corporate debt rather than mortgage bonds. CLOs are also generally made up of bad debts that are likely to default. Another similarity is that they've been exploited in exactly the same way. The banks have got billions riding on bets to do with these bundles of loans. Historically, they've always been a safe investment. Businesses tend to pay back their loans, and so there's not much risk that the loans that make up the CLO will go bad. And even if a few of them do, the diverse portfolio that makes up a CLO generally ensures the safety of the overall product. However, people are only just waking up to how damaging these CLOs truly are to everyone. Because right now, during our current economic recession, a large number of companies are starting to default on their loans. And the fact that CLOs are made up of loans to generally failing companies makes this all the more pressing. But mass defaults would only happen in the event of some sort of larger economic crisis affecting businesses. A crisis very much like the pandemic. When COVID began, an alarmingly large amount of the underlying loans that made up CLOs went bad. The markets reflected this when the price of CLOs tumbled in March of 2020, when the pandemic first hit. Did the banks realize that these products were risky and reduce their exposure though? Of course not. Instead, they bought even more of them while they were cheap. Citigroup alone bought $2 billion worth of CLOs, all while they were cheap, and made $100 million by selling them later. And this kind of easy money is addictive for these banks. It gives the bankers huge bonuses, all for really doing nothing, which is why all the major banks bought in. And only today has this left them incredibly exposed. Wells Fargo has nearly $40 billion invested in CLOs, and that's just the stuff we know about, because banks are very careful to hide these investments in shell companies to throw off regulators and prying eyes. However, whilst this might sound complicated, there's a reason they're trying to hide this up, because CLOs will affect the whole economy, and when the economy affects society, this affects affects the entire world. This will affect people's businesses, people's families, people's jobs, crime, and everything to do with society. And the risk that these CLOs have if the economy continues to decline is very, very high, as more and more of these loans in CLOs will go bad. And if enough of them fail, it will be just like 2008 all over again, but worse. These CLOs are compounding our economic recession. When the economy goes down, they double the negative effects. And with the combination of CLOs and CDOs, banks are facing incredible risk, and so are we. All it would take to topple them is just one small push, and suddenly millions of people's money is evaporated. So the banks have exposed themselves to massive amounts of risk yet again. The habit of continually risking the world's economy to make a few bucks has left people angry. But trust me when I say that it only gets worse from here. When you see how things really work behind the surface, you realize how dark this rabbit hole truly goes. So the banks have exposed themselves to massive amounts of risk yet again, and we've already seen the lengths banks are willing to go for profit. And it's this lack of accountability over the years that leads us on to the second reason on our list: overconfidence. You see, everyone knows that banks are corrupt, but nobody thought that they could be so brazen in their criminal activity as to literally manipulate entire financial systems. But they have. They've made themselves monstrously rich at the expense of the world, and barely anyone's heard about it. And it all goes back to a system called LIBOR, a tool that was meant to regulate the banks but ended up as yet another form of mass exploitation. LIBOR, or the London Interbank Offered Rate, is a general exchange rate for loan interest rates between the many big banks operating in London. The idea is that banks each report what interest rate they would usually pay to borrow cash, and then the average would be taken. This interest rate is applicable to over $350 trillion in assets, so it has far-reaching implications from mortgages to student loans. It's also meant to be a sort of temperature check for the financial system. A low rate means banks are eager to lend money and therefore think the system is secure. A high rate would mean the opposite: the financial system is precarious and loans are riskier, so they demand a higher interest rate. The problem though was putting the power to change this rate into the hands of the banks. If they all agreed to fudge the numbers, they could still pay whatever they wanted whilst telling the regulators they were paying more or less, and this meant they could push LIBOR up or down whenever they liked, leading to a misvaluing of all those $350 trillion worth of assets that LIBOR touched. This meant they could profit from all the deals they made, selling stuff for more than its worth or buying things for less than their value. And when the banks realized this, they began to form a huge cartel, agreeing to manipulate LIBOR together for their own gain at everyone else's loss. Of course, all of the manipulation led to people losing out on their mortgages and student loans, and the banks would manipulate the interest rates for years. Whistleblowers have stated that it was widespread as early as 1991 and continued until the early 2010s, which means for over 2 decades, Deutsche Bank, Barclays, Citigroup, JP Morgan Chase, and the Royal Bank of Scotland all manipulated LIBOR, and when this was all discovered, only 5 bankers were actually found guilty. The fines barely made a dent either, not getting anywhere near close to the amount that they gained from the LIBOR scam. In fact, for the banks, this is just the price of business. But you see, this is just one part of the fraud puzzle. The banks are constantly manipulating other markets to their own gain. The gold markets were once an accurate representation of the amount that gold actually costs, and they were backed up by the physical thing. But that's far from the case today, and a large part of why is down to market manipulation. Trades on gold rose significantly, far outweighing the actual amount of gold there is. It got to the point that 250,000 tons of gold were being traded every day. And to put into perspective, this is more than has ever been mined in all of history. And with algorithms, masses of made up gold and silver could be traded in a split second. This was prime for abuse, and JP Morgan were quick to exploit the gold market. They had such influence and weight on the massive gold market that JP Morgan could manipulate it however they wanted. They used algorithms to feign interest in gold, creating imaginary demand or supply for it, and when the market moved up or down in response to the faked interest, JP Morgan could profit off the difference. Eventually they were fined $920 million for doing just this, so you can only guess that they made a hell of a lot more from the scam. And the sheer amount of scams the big banks are running, combined with the lack of consequences, has made them unafraid of getting caught. Because if the banks eventually collapse as they did in the 2008 recession, the governments have to bail them out. These banks are so confident on being bailed out because they know how much leverage they have over governments and society, which is why they're not afraid of collapsing. These fines could cripple them, but they know they'll likely be bailed out, because if they're not, this will affect millions of people's personal banking accounts. This will affect government debt. This will affect entire economies, entire households. The government can't risk the major banks falling, and so the banks understand how much leverage they have over the world. world. And it's this overconfidence that leads the banks to collapse, as they always know they'll be resurrected. But there is another reason why the banks are getting so overconfident. Investment banking has seen significant losses over the past few years. You see, the banks have caught wind of the coming crisis and have been scrambling to make money in any way possible. And it's this current recession we're wallowing in that is the final reason the banks have gotten so cocky recently. So far, we've only talked about things that the banks have actually done themselves to ensure their own downfall. And whilst it's a long list, it isn't the only thing working against them. Greater macroeconomic factors have been building for quite some time now. Wars, supply shortages, and the massive effects of COVID have led to an unprecedented downturn in the world economy that shows no signs of stopping. And the banks certainly aren't going to be safe from the recession either. In fact, investment banks specifically are already starting to feel the pain, with investment banking now being a shrinking market. During 2021, investment banking revenue dropped by a shocking 38% from what it was just a year before. Along with all the things we've already talked about, a recession simply makes people less willing to use the bank's services. Companies have stopped going public as well in the face of an unstable market, and this has taken a huge chunk out of the bank's profits. All of this has led to what JP Morgan's CEO calls a coming hurricane. And considering the houses of cards we've described, it's unlikely that all the banks will survive the storm. Credit Suisse, for example, is going into an emergency restructuring in the face of massive losses. Deutsche Bank is also looking on the verge of collapse, with their valuation going down by 15% in just 1 year. And we may be coming to the point where these massive criminal empires finally begin to fall. Everything they've done might finally be catching up to them. But a more cynical conclusion could be that collapse isn't something the banks are actually afraid of. As we mentioned before, why else act so recklessly? We've seen they're likely to just get bailed out, as has been done with every other financial crash. And once again, it could be the taxpayers footing the bill for their crimes. We can only hope that out of the coming crisis, some proper regulation and rules can come into effect. But knowing the full control banks have over society, governments, and the population, it seems like this is far-fetched to believe. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more controversial videos that I can't release to the public, consider joining the channel. For just $5.99 a month, you'll have access to monthly exclusive videos not released to the public, where you can watch our videos on Ted Kaczynski and our Mr. Robot series review, and soon we'll be releasing a video on the man behind Gay Frogs. In addition to the exclusive videos, you'll also have access to my private Discord group. All you have to do is click the join button below or click the link in the description.